Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. International gold prices hit a record high. This happens as tensions across the world grow because of the coronavirus and greater economic turbulence. On today's show, we try to break down gold pricing and understand how the precious metal is priced. What are the impacts of such sharp price increases in its value? Joining us for this conversation today is Arun Kumar, who's an economist. He joins us from Haryana. Also joining us is Professor Peter Newman, who's an environmental scientist, author, and educator. He is currently Professor of Sustainability at Curtin University. He joins us from Perth. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Arun Kumar, I'd like to begin with you. And before we discuss what the reasons are for these record price highs, explain to us, break down for the common viewers how gold pricing works and how is it unique?
You know, gold prices are determined by supply and demand. Typically, China and India are the big places where the demand is very high. We were importing about 800 to 900 tons of gold every year till the pandemic hit us and the prices of gold have risen. Similarly, China has also been importing a lot of gold. So our prices in India are determined by international prices, and those are determined by demand and supply factors. Now, in the recent period, the demand has gone up because whenever there's uncertainty, what happens is that people go to safe haven. And today the corona pandemic has created massive uncertainty. Trade has also created a lot of uncertainty because of the trade war that's taking place. There's deglobalization. We don't know which way the economies will turn, what will happen to the imports and the exports of the economy. So, there's a lot of uncertainty in the global markets, and that's why people are moving to the safe haven of gold. So that's the reason that demand is increased, whereas the supply remains very low. It's based on the mining in the big countries like South Africa, Russia, and so on. So that doesn't change very much. And therefore, what happens is the price changes as the demand goes up. And that's why, you see the spike in prices that is taking place now.
Right. Mr. Arun Kumar, I want to talk about how supply is remaining constant throughout the years. But before that, I want to talk more about what you mentioned is the trade war that is happening between the US and China, how that's creating greater uncertainty. Just expand a little more how that relates to gold and why people consider it such a safe bet.
So, typically what we used to have earlier was a commodity money. And when you have commodity money, you hold a commodity, and gold is a precious metal. So by holding small amounts of it, you can hold a large amount of value. So that's why gold has been seen as an alternative to money as such. So whenever there's uncertainty because of, as I said, the trade war, the COVID, etc., the trade war was started last year or even the year before between China and the US, because US has been accusing China of, manipulating trade. They're keeping its currency down, etc., etc. So, US has been putting levies and China was responding to that. There's some agreement between the two in January, but I think that's now completely broken down. Because of the pandemic, the US has been accusing that China has deliberately spread the virus and did not take action in time. Now, whatever be the truth of it, the point is that, as a result, a lot of restrictions have taken place. Even in India, the Chinese goods and the Chinese contracts, etc., there's been restrictions put. So various countries are acting against China. And what it will do is, in a sense, deglobalize, because supply chains have become very long. They were, centered in China. So as soon as the pandemic hit, supply chains started getting distorted. And when that happened, production in various major economies started getting impacted. In India also, we noticed an impact because 80% of our raw material for medicines comes from China. So as soon as there were disruption in the supply chain, we also saw medicine prices, etc., rise in India. So in a sense, various countries are now trying to say that we should shorten supply chain. We should start producing more in India, more in their own country. India is also planning to do that under a plan called the Atmanirbhar Bharat, which means self-reliant India. So India is saying that, Indian companies should start producing more, will import less from China. So this is a kind of a trade problem that has taken place between various nations. And therefore, there's a lot of uncertainty in the global market, and that's resulting in, people moving to safe haven. Dollar is one safe haven, but the gold is even more considered to be a safe haven. So more move into the gold.
Right. Stay with me, Mr. Arun Kumar. I'm going to come back to you and we're going to talk more about everything that you've mentioned here. But I want to jump to Professor Peter Newman and talk to him about what you mentioned was the supply aspect of gold here, how only a couple of mines exist. There isn't enough incentive for other miners to go in and explore for more gold. Professor Peter Newman, give us insight into that matter. What really is happening on the supply end of this?
I come from Western Australia, which is a mining state, and we're on the Indian Ocean side of Australia, and the mining community has maintained its output during the COVID crisis. It didn't have to stop, and gold was one of the big export items. We have the biggest gold mine in Kalgoorlie in the world and 10 other mines. We also export a lot of iron ore, of aluminium. These are big export items. And as the demand in the economy went down, the price of gold went up. So they started producing more gold. And they're very sensitive to that. They can wind it up or wind it down depending on the economy. And so over the last 120 years that we've been producing gold, it goes up and down in its production depending on the world's price. And right now the world price is really firing high, and so they're churning it out as quick as they can because it's a very good market.
Right. So do you think, as seeing these price spikes, there will be a greater, more aggressive turn towards going and trying to find more gold here? That has always been one of the main concerns, that there just isn't enough profit margin for you to go out and explore for more options.
Yes, we've had enough. When the price goes right down, there's still enough of a margin for our gold miners to keep working, but they slow down. They try to save so that they can get by because they know it's going to go back up again. That's one thing you can guarantee, is the world will have troubles. There will be uncertainty again, and the price of gold will go up. Governments buy it as well as people, of course, in order to keep resilience in their system. And so, yeah, there is a move to start up again some of the small gold mines that have been just waiting for that opportunity. So you do find that, and there's even people going out prospecting. They have little devices that they wander around the bush looking for gold, and it beeps at them and they get a bit of gold. And right now they're all out there trying to get a bit more gold because it's really worthwhile.
Right at point there. Jumping back to Mr. Arun Kumar. Mr. Kumar, when we're talking about this and when we're talking about what's happening, one of the questions that keeps on coming up is that, all right, gold prices are rising, but what really is the cause for such a steep and such a fast pace at which they're rising? It seems like every day there is quite a significant jump. Is this unprecedented?
No, in times of uncertainty, I remember, for instance, when the Afghanistan crisis came up in 1979-80, that time also gold prices shot up very dramatically. So what it shows is that, you see, supply of gold being limited. If people move into one asset, that asset price rises. And nowadays the currencies are not linked to gold. Like till 1971, there was a gold backing of the dollar. When de Gaulle started sending gold to Fort Knox, it was taken off, So you don't get gold, when you go to the American central bank and ask them for dollars, for gold, they'll only give you more dollars. So given that gold is limited in supply and the demand has suddenly risen. And why has the demand risen? As I said, uncertainty has increased,
Right.
This uncertainty is because, you don't know what will happen vis-a-vis the pandemic, which assets will fall. For instance, the stock market fell dramatically in March. We don't know whether there'll be a second round, whether production will be again affected adversely. And if that happens, then, people will move to assets which are safe because the stock market can again decline. So all these uncertainties that are there vis-a-vis assets, that is what is driving the demand for gold. And that's why, it's not the consumers who are consuming more. In India, the sales of gold in the retail have declined, but obviously it is people who are holding gold as a safe haven. So
right.
Even if a small increase in demand takes place because of uncertainty, the gold prices will rise quite substantially. And that's what I think you see, that the consumer is consuming less, but I think the investors are investing more into it. And that's why, the demand for gold has gone up very substantially. And you see every day a price rise in gold.
Mr. Arun Kumar, we talk about the larger economic fallout of something like this. What do you think is something to keep in mind, especially when we talk about an economy like India, which is one of the largest consumers of gold, and China? These large economies, what do you think is not just the economic fallout, but also the cultural fallout of this?
Because of the lockdown, the Indian economy has declined very substantially. In April, it declined by about 75%. It's still down by about 50%. And therefore, a lot of asset prices are going to decline. And that's where people with assets are probably liquefying them and moving into gold. But gold is considered to be an unproductive asset. Apart from the increase in price, it does not give you a return. You don't actually produce anything out of it. Like if you invested in a machine or in a house, you could rent out the house, you could produce something out of the machine, and that would give you a return. But if you hold gold, it's only the price rise that is your return. So if the prices don't rise, then your return is very low, and that's what has happened in the last, say 10 years, and that's why the demand for gold was not rising very much, and it was pretty steady. But now that there's uncertainty, the demand for gold has gone up. So what happens is that, apart from the cultural factor, because in the Indian weddings and, for the poor people, it has been a security to hold gold. So the demand for gold was the highest in India, and now China has replaced India in the last 15, 20 years. Because in these economies, people use gold for a variety of purposes, not only as an asset, but also to show off their wealth, to use it in weddings and to show off at the social occasions, etc. So, there's a cultural aspect associated with gold in terms of, what your social standing is. You show off the gold that you have.
Right. Professor Peter Newman, on that point of cultural importance of gold, I think it's also worthwhile and very interesting to compare how that pans out from where you're speaking to us from Australia. What is the cultural significance, if at all, of gold there?
Well, there is a cultural significance of it, but not as deep as in China and India. And I think it's important at this time to get that advice from Professor Kumar and try to think about where you could invest your money in a more productive way, because culturally it might be safe, but it's not going to produce wealth into the future. So as a culture, everybody needs to see that this is not just a downturn with all kinds of bad aspects to it. It's an opportunity. The economy is being recreated right now. Schumpeter, who is an economist from the 1930s, first showed us that there is what he called creative destruction during collapses. It is a creative time because the economy renews itself and grows again very quickly. And if you're ready and if you invest in solar energy, in electric vehicles, in smart cities, these kind of things that are going to grow very quickly now, then you'll get a return. And that will be a lot better than investing in gold. So it is important, I think, to try to take that on. And every economy, every culture has to come to terms with that. I don't know if we're going to be better off in Australia than India or China. It's actually quite a challenge for us all to see that we will come through this. Let's make this an opportunity, not a crisis of fear. We've got to have some hope. And I think that's a big cultural issue that we need to address.
Right. Mr. Kumar, what are your thoughts to whatever Professor Peter Newman just stated right now, and especially when we talk about the recovery process, especially for India and for China and South Asia as a whole?
So, China recovered very quickly because it imposed a very dramatic lockdown. It locked down the Hubei province and Wuhan. It didn't allow it to spread to other parts of the Chinese, country. Therefore, its economy could revive quite quickly. The first quarter, the rate of growth was minus 6.8%, but the second quarter it rebounded to 3.2%. But that cannot be said about a large number of other economies which went into lockdown later as the disease spread. The Indian economy, is still tanking quite badly as compared to last year. The US economy is also not doing that well. In the first 10 weeks, it lost 44 million employment in the economy. So given all this, the chances that investment will increase are very, very slim. In fact, in India, the expectation is that 30% of the small and the medium businesses will collapse and 30% of retail trade will collapse. So investment will turn negative almost, as far as I can see. Only some sectors like medicines and FMCG, telecom, only these are the sectors where there'll be positive growth, but otherwise almost everything else will be negative. For instance, airlines, hotels, tourism, etc., etc. So, the chances that investment will grow are very slim. And therefore, at this point of time, people will simply maintain what they have rather than invest in a big way in new investments. That will happen only maybe a year and a half down the line when the economies begin to recover and uncertainty declines. At this point, given the uncertainty, I don't see too much investment for the kind of creative destruction that Professor Newman was mentioning. That happens under normal circumstances in a business cycle. But this is worse than a usual business cycle. It's worse than a depression of the 29 to 33. We have never faced this kind of a situation in the world where supply froze and demand declined dramatically. This kind of lockdown has not been seen in modern day economies. So we really don't understand how things will work out economically. And therefore, I don't expect massive investments to take place at this point of time in new, energy and various other kind of things. I'd love to see that. As a development economist, I'd love to see a different development path. But, for that, society has to discuss what kind of a new development path it wants. At this point of time, trade, transport, the development, economics, all of them are going to see new challenges. But we are not thinking about those at the moment. I'm glad that Professor Newman is thinking about it and doing something about it, hopefully. But I don't see that as a general trend in the world of economics or in the world of development economics, because everybody is very busy, trying to sort of cope with the crisis. In India, 200 million people have lost employment in the unorganized sector. They are the poor, so roughly 800 million people would have slipped below the poverty line. That would have happened in most of the developing world. So the resources are very short at this point. I think if we can put our resources in seeing that people don't die of hunger and there's no societal breakdown, that would be my first priority. Then I'd think about other such things and doing a new development paradigm.
So Arun Kumar, now you as an economist and your community at large, given that we are just facing the first wave of the coronavirus outbreak, and it is expected that there might be a second wave as well, given that economies all over the world are in shambles, what do you see as the way forward? Because given how there are complete lockdowns, it is causing economies to collapse.
So, as I said, at this point of time, we don't know. I mean, countries like Spain and Vietnam, which had managed the COVID quite well, brought it down, are seeing a second wave after the first wave. And this is not even winter time. In winter time, people had expected a second wave like happened during Spanish flu. When the first wave came, the second wave came again in the winter, and more people died in the second wave as the disease spread. Hopefully we'll have a vaccine sometime towards the end of the year. Maybe there may be a medicine, and we understand the virus much better and we know how to treat it better. But in spite of all that, experts say that it will be probably a year before we get a vaccine and or medicine. And by the time we have got enough doses to vaccinate the entire Indian subcontinent, it'll be a couple of years. So given all that difficulty, I see that, we have to work at a survival package, that the 800 million people who slip below the poverty line, they survive. The small businesses, of which there are 60 million in India, they survive because they are the largest employers. They are collapsing because their working capital is gone. A number of large industries like airlines, hotels, etc., they are also on the verge of collapse. So if we can prevent that collapse from taking place and use the time of lockdown to ramp up our testing facilities, contact tracing, to ramp up our facilities of hospitals and nurses and doctors, then that would be time well spent. So I think at this point of time, I'd say we should do a survival package and keep on the minimum demand that can be generated by doing a survival package.
Right.
In the advanced countries, it may be quite different because there they have more resources. There the collapse is not so big. But India, for instance, the large number of poor people migrated back to the villages. So the workers in the cities, there are shortages of workers in the cities for certain
Right.
industries that have started opening up. So that kind of problem doesn't exist in the advanced countries. But so our problems are different from those of the advanced countries like Australia or US. We will see a much slower return back to the normal. So we have to plan for the coming 2 years or so to see how to keep the poor people from having problems, to help our medical system, which is very inadequate, etc., etc.
At that point, thank you so much, Mr. Arun Kumar, for joining us from Haryana, and Professor Peter Newman for joining us from Perth. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. Now, in the first segment, we talked about why gold prices have been seeing a record high. Now, in this segment, we're going to talk about the cultural and historical importance of gold in various cultures, in various societies, how it continues to date, and also the psychological reasons to why people gravitate towards luxury items. Joining us for this conversation today is Professor Samina Yasmeen, who's a teacher and researcher at the University of Western Australia School of Social Sciences and the director and founder of the university's Centre for Muslim States and Societies. She joins us from Perth. Also joining us today is Ms. Aleksandra Djuric, who's a professor and psychotherapist. She works with students and also has her own private practice. She joins us from Belgrade. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Professor Samina Yasmeen, I'd like to begin with you. Now, when we talk about the turbulent economic conditions causing many people to move towards gold, which is being considered and pegged as a safe investment, there is also something to be understood about why people for so long have wanted to acquire gold. Its cultural and historical importance. Shed some light on that for us, please.
Well, I look at it first as a woman into this whole issue of acquiring gold. I think what we need to understand is that historically, when women got married, they really didn't have any economic security other than what their husbands provided for or their family provided for. So in that context, gold became significant because if you had gold with you, no matter what happens, you would be able to have some stability. Now, that wasn't really guaranteed, but I think that was at the heart of women being very focused on gold. But obviously for men, again, it's always been the fact that if everything else fails, there's a security element in that you'd be able to get that. I think where the problem comes in is that initial economic reasoning behind it has gradually shifted into a cultural significance, which really becomes a marker of economic differentiation. So those who want to establish that they're really from a good background, economically strong, they would try and focus more on gold. And so culturally and historically, I think it started from a very basic economic need, but then I think now it's become a part of the cultural way of showing off how rich you are.
Prof. Samina Yasmeen, now from what you're telling me about how important it has been historically and culturally to ensure some degree of financial security for women, I want to connect this to what we're seeing unfold in front of ourselves right now, which is this pandemic, which has caused economic upheaval for everyone all across the world. But how is it significantly and uniquely impacting women?
Well, I think from the impact of COVID-19 on women really is in different ways. It's not just simply related to gold. It's a fact that because of lockdowns and because of reduced employment opportunities, women are the ones who are suffering more than men. It's not that men aren't suffering, but overall proportionately, to be culturally different, women would suffer more. But even in societies where there is not much multicultural presence, they would still suffer more than men. In that sense, women become very significant sort of targets of violence, but also economic insecurity. And it's in that context, again, that we see gold becomes very significant. If you are stuck at home, you're not sure whether you can get a job, you're not sure, and in fact, you're likely to experience more cultural pressure, but also domestic violence, then gold becomes a way of feeling safe that whatever happens, at least you have this much that you can go with. But again, as I said before, it's not a guarantee. We think about gold as a way of protecting us or saving us in very dire situations, whether violence or economic insecurity. But when it comes to reality, it really depends on who holds the power in the family or in the situation, who can decide whether or not gold is even helping you to survive.
Right. Those are important points you make there. And something that you talked about here was social mobility and the display of wealth being important. You talked about this earlier, Professor Samina. Yasmeen, I want to take this to Ms. Djuric. This very question about why it's important to display wealth, what significance does that have for human beings? I mean, this is something we don't really explore, not from a psychology aspect of it. But why is it important?
Well, it's one way if we need some kinds of money and gold to feel safe. That is economically safe. That is okay. But it's completely the other thing if we need material things to compensate our self-esteem. We often see people who need material things in that really specific way, and that is the way to hide their own emptiness and lack of self-esteem, and they tend to compensate their own sense and lack of identity through that specific way of displaying wealth and material symbols. So unfortunately, that is not only the sign of low self-esteem and lack of identity, but also maybe that is the way that they gain love, because for some example, if parents express their love with material things, that can be a model for them.
Right. Also talking about luxury items here and the importance that is pegged to them. Do you think that humans often overestimate their importance, especially when we talk about investing in things that might not have as much as utility as they have that glamour attached to them?
Yes, because materialism is also a set of values, values that say we are rich, we are important, we are close to God, and that is for them ultimate psychological power. But material things on the long way cannot compensate self of identity and belonging, and of course, true intimacy with people.
Right. Professor Samina, Yasmeen, going back to you and talking about the times that we're living through and how you think this will impact traditions. Now, gold, of course, has been a central aspect of South Asian wedding culture, and in that we're going to see certain changes, but also expanding onto a greater part of it. How do you see this pandemic impacting traditions and cultures?
Well, I think at one level we need to understand that because of the increasing price of gold, already, for example, in Pakistan, we were witnessing people shifting to gold-plated jewelry rather than gold jewelry. And then while initially it was cheap, even when that became more popular, the demand increased, the price of gold-plated jewelry has also increased. But I think now when we come into the COVID-19 era, and after that, one thing that we do need to understand is that the significance of gold is not just simply going to be with reference to women and how they are going to use that, or families to show off their wealth, but I think it's also going to get caught in networks of people who are trying to blackmail, or sorry, not blackmail, but use them across boundaries and really sneak them in. For example, we're seeing in India that There are cases where they've been trying to smuggle gold in because the families need that or they think they must have it for weddings, but even for other events. And if it's not, if they're not able to bring it normally, then they'll bring it through, as you might have heard, even through diplomatic bag channels. So I think overall, my sense is that it's not new, because with the increasing gold prices, in countries where gold has been so significant, there was a shift towards jewelry and towards things that looked like gold but were not. But now when we come into a point where gold prices are increasing, then I think families think that there's a greater need to have gold, because if you have that, then you're not just simply able to show off, but you're also able to definitely ensure your long-term economic survivability. So I think there are going to be different processes people would go through. The other bit that I think we need to be aware of is that it's also going to increase chances of international criminal networks, not just simply in terms of smuggling, but also in terms of putting people in a position where they think that they have no option but to part with gold to protect their loved ones elsewhere. So I think there are going to be different impacts on the families and different celebratory events, but also how people live in the world today.
Right. Ms. Aleksandra Djuric, now one of the main themes that has run throughout our show is the financial insecurity that is attached to this pandemic, that's also attached to the rising prices of gold, also attached to the economic turbulence that we're seeing. Now, you working in this regard, helping patients, helping them deal with anxiety and stress, what would you tell people about the financial insecurity and the financial stress during this time?
Yes, that is a very good question, because it's a question that it's also going to be asked in the future time, because we are going to deal with economical crisis during maybe next year. So it's really a fear that is valid. We have people who are losing their jobs, etc. That's why I said it's one way if you want to have some kind of safety with money and with gold or something like that. That is a really okay need, but it's other displaying of power with money that it's not psychological good. And on the other, you're displaying power with material things. You want to show that everything is okay. So those are two extremes. You must be in your adult way of dealing things. You must, I say my patients, you must see reality as it is. We cannot ignore the fact that we are in really maybe not so good times with economics, but also we must be realistic. We don't need to stash money all the time and living in that kind of fear. And the other way, we see rich people, they are displaying power and material things like nothing is going on. So those are two extreme behaviors. I think something in the middle. We must ask ourselves, what are we going to do? Okay, if we lose job, what are the alternatives? What can we do? Where can we get a job for the first time? Maybe not in our own structure of work, but in some kind other of structure of work for the first time. That is okay. We might really.
Professor Samina, Yasmeen, now earlier on the show we were talking about the fact that it's not unprecedented that we would have seen such high gold rates. It also happened during the Afghanistan invasion. We've also seen great economic turbulence throughout history. But just taking on a broader aspect of all of this, how do you think societies are impacted by such uncertainty, by such economic uncertainty when we look at past trends?
Okay, I was just thinking as you were talking about gold is that I'm talking to you here sitting very close to, I think, the largest gold mine in Southern Hemisphere. And it's interesting that I've been following what happens, not because they're neighbors, but because we can hear the sound. is that there's been a push for people to go and acquire gold. And that's why, as you had been discussing earlier, because everybody wanted to have gold, the price of gold has become very high, and people have started looking at it as something that they must have. That is really going to shift the way people start relating to each other. And I think I would agree with our sort of other speaker that it is time that communities start understanding to say, gold may be significant, but there are other ways of being comfortable. But that again requires people to be able to interact with each other and look at life other than just simply the material goods. Now, I know when COVID-19 started, my initial reaction was that everybody would go into a very sort of deep, philosophical, reflective state of mind. And people did go through that. And, depending upon where you are, either you became more religious or you became more concerned and there's anxiety. But it's interesting that now people are coming back to the same models of identifying themselves vis-a-vis others. So the show of wealth, the show of style, the different brand names, they have a lot of significance, even though a lot of companies are going out of sort of business. But what I'm also taken by the fact is that something like face mask, which is a health requirement, that's moved into the fashion realm as well. So suddenly you find different designs of face masks. So I guess in a way, it's a long way of answering your question. I think what COVID-19 has done is to make people deal with a very different situation, because the last pandemic was 100 years ago. Other than those who have lived that long, people don't really know about it that much. So for them, it's a very new experience. So as they're trying to deal with that, and as they're also trying to deal with a lot of economic uncertainty, which has surpassed 2008 global financial crisis, they're really at sea. They're trying to find which way should they go. And I think some would become very sort of introspective, religious, and others are going to get more and more blatant about use of money, to flashing the money, so to speak. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I can say.
Right. At that point, thank you so much, Professor Samina, Yasmeen, for joining us, giving us your important insight. We always value it. Also, thank you, Ms. Aleksandra Djuric, for joining us from Belgrade. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next time with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.